The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as reporters shuffled into the press section, their notepads at the ready. The case had captured national attention, not because of its legal significance, but because of the person standing trial, Karoline Leavitt, the White House press secretary under President Donald Trump. Karoline adjusted the cuff of her blazer and took a deep breath. This wasn't where she had expected to be today. Just hours ago, she had been in the White House briefing room, fielding questions with her usual sharp wit and unflinching confidence. Now, she stood before Judge Raymond Winslow, a man infamous for his disdain toward anything remotely connected to the Trump administration. "Ms. Leavitt, do you understand the charges against you?" Judge Winslow's voice carried a hint of amusement. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his eyes twinkling with skepticism. Karoline lifted her chin. "Your Honor, I understand the allegations, but I also understand the Constitution. And I believe this trial is about more than just me. It's about the fundamental right to free speech and political discourse." A murmur ran through the spectators. Even some of the reporters seemed taken aback by her poise. The judge chuckled. Well, the press secretary thinks she's a constitutional scholar. This should be interesting." Laughter rippled through the room, and Karoline felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She knew this was going to be an uphill battle. The case against her was flimsy at best. Something about obstruction of journalistic inquiry, after a heated confrontation with a mainstream media reporter who had accused her of spreading misinformation. The problem? No such law existed. The charges were, at best, a political stunt. Her attorney, Daniel Mercer, whispered to her, "Stay calm. Let them laugh. We'll make them eat their words soon enough." She nodded, but deep down, she had already decided. She wouldn't just sit back and let Mercer handle everything. She was going to fight this herself. The laughter in the courtroom faded, but the smirk on Judge Winslow's face remained. Karoline took a deep breath, keeping her expression neutral. She had faced hostile reporters, aggressive politicians, and a media landscape that thrived on controversy. But standing in a courtroom, being treated like a clueless amateur, was a new kind of challenge. "Prosecution may present its case," the judge said, still leaning back in his chair, as if this were nothing more than a formality. The district attorney, Leonard Greaves, rose from his seat, adjusting his tie with a smug confidence that matched the judge's. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen, today we examine a clear violation of journalistic integrity, an abuse of power at the highest levels of government. Ms. Leavitt knowingly and willfully obstructed the free press, preventing the American people from accessing the truth." Karoline's jaw tightened. That was a blatant misrepresentation of the facts. She had confronted a biased reporter who had twisted her words, but at no point had she prevented anyone from doing their job. "As evidence, I present Exhibit A," Greaves continued, motioning to a screen at the side of the courtroom. A video clip began to play, one Karoline knew all too well. It showed a press briefing from 2 months ago. A journalist, Mark Atwood from a major liberal network, had interrupted her mid-sentence, falsely claiming she had spread misinformation about an economic report. She had firmly corrected him, pushing back against his accusations. The confrontation had gone viral, and while conservatives had cheered her response, mainstream media had framed it as an attack on the free press. The video ended, and Greaves turned back to the jury with a theatrical flourish. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not just about words. This is about a representative of the government using her position to suppress truth and punish those who challenge her." Karoline clenched her fists. That was not what had happened, and Greaves knew it. But before she could respond, the judge chuckled again. "Ms. Leavitt," he said, shaking his head, "it's one thing to argue with reporters on TV, quite another to justify it in a court of law. Do you really expect us to believe that your actions were not meant to silence dissent?" Karoline's heart pounded. She knew what was happening. This wasn't a legal trial, it was political theater. The judge and prosecutor were playing to an audience, assuming she'd fold under pressure. But they had underestimated her. She stood, smoothing her blazer. "Your Honor, if the prosecution is done with their dramatics, I'd like to respond." The judge smirked. By all means, Ms. Leavitt, enlighten us. Karoline locked eyes with the jury. The First Amendment protects freedom of the press. It does not, however, protect a journalist's right to spread falsehoods without being challenged. I did not obstruct the press. I exercised my own First Amendment rights to correct a lie. If that's a crime, then we have much bigger problems than this trial. A murmur spread through the room. Even some of the reporters shifted uncomfortably. The judge's smirk faded just a little. Careful, Ms. Leavitt. This isn't a campaign rally. Stick to legal arguments. She smiled. Oh, don't worry, Your Honor. I intend to. A tense silence settled over the courtroom. Karoline remained standing, her expression calm but unwavering. She had spent years battling the press, refining her arguments under the harsh scrutiny of live television. This courtroom was just another stage, and if Judge Winslow thought he could rattle her, he was mistaken. The judge cleared his throat. Very well, Ms. Leavitt. You've made your point, but that doesn't change the fact that your actions could be interpreted as an attempt to intimidate the press. Karoline arched an eyebrow. Could be interpreted, Your Honor? Since when does the law operate on vague interpretations instead of facts? A few gasps rippled through the audience. Even Greaves, the prosecutor, shifted uncomfortably. Winslow's eyes narrowed. Watch yourself, Ms. Leavitt. You're in a court of law, not a press briefing. With all due respect, Your Honor, I'm well aware of that. And I'm also aware that I am being prosecuted over a non-existent law, she replied coolly. Greaves quickly intervened. Ms. Leavitt, let's talk about intent. Your confrontation with Mark Atwood was aggressive, was it not? Karoline folded her arms. It was firm. I don't believe correcting someone who is misrepresenting facts qualifies as aggression. If it did, we'd have to put half of Congress on trial. A few chuckles broke out in the audience. Greaves pressed on. You interrupted Atwood. You accused him of lying. You even cut off his follow-up question. Isn't that an abuse of power? She gave him a sharp look. No, it's called a debate. If interrupting someone in a conversation is an abuse of power, I look forward to seeing every CNN panelist prosecuted next. More laughter, this time louder. The judge slammed his gavel. Order. Order in the court. Karoline turned to the jury, her voice measured but strong. Let's be honest about what this trial is really about. This isn't about the law. This is about punishing someone for standing up to the media narrative. If any one of you pushed back against a false accusation in your workplace, should you be charged in a court of law? No, because that's not how justice works. Greaves exhaled sharply, clearly realizing she wasn't going to be bullied into submission. Ms. Leavitt, I remind you that this is a legal proceeding, not a political debate. Karoline smiled. I agree, which is why I'm still waiting for you to cite an actual law I've broken. The courtroom fell silent. Greaves opened his mouth, then closed it. The judge shifted in his seat. Karoline pressed forward. If there's no statute that I violated, then this case has no standing. So, unless the prosecution would like to admit that they are using the courts to target political opponents, I'd like to see the actual legal basis for this trial. The judge's smirk was gone now. He cleared his throat, clearly realizing that Karoline was putting him and the prosecutor in a difficult position. For the first time since the trial had begun, the momentum had shifted. Karoline remained seated at the defense table, tapping a pen lightly against her notebook. Across the courtroom, Greaves and his team huddled together, whispering urgently. Judge Winslow had left the bench for the recess, but the tension in the room remained thick. Daniel Mercer leaned in. They didn't expect you to go on the offensive that quickly. Now they're scrambling to find something, anything that will stick. Karoline nodded, but she wasn't about to get complacent. This trial wasn't about justice, it was about optics. The prosecution and the judge wanted a spectacle, something they could use to damage her credibility and, by extension, the Trump administration. She scanned the courtroom. A mix of political operatives, journalists, and curious citizens filled the seats. Some had their arms crossed, skeptical. Others took furious notes, eager to see how this would play out. When the recess ended, Judge Winslow re-entered, looking slightly less amused than before. He banged his gavel once. "Let's continue. Mr. Greaves, you may proceed." Greaves stood, his confidence slightly dimmed but not gone. "Your Honor, while Ms. Leavitt has made compelling rhetorical points, we cannot ignore the real-world impact of her actions. The press serves as the Fourth Estate, a crucial check on power. And when a high-ranking government official directly targets a journalist, it creates a chilling effect." Karoline kept her expression neutral, but inside, she scoffed. The chilling effect argument had become a catch-all excuse for suppressing speech they didn't like. Greaves turned to the jury. "We have a witness who can speak to this impact firsthand." The prosecution calls Mark Atwood to the stand. The doors to the courtroom swung open, and the journalist in question entered. Mark Atwood was in his early 40s, with carefully styled hair and the demeanor of someone who had spent years curating his public image. He walked with confidence, though Karoline noticed he avoided looking directly at her. Atwood was sworn in, and Greaves wasted no time. "Mr. Atwood, can you describe what happened the day of your press briefing exchange with Ms. Leavitt?" Atwood folded his hands. "Certainly. I was doing my job, asking tough but fair questions. When I challenged Ms. Leavitt on a misleading economic statement, she became aggressive, accused me of spreading misinformation, and cut off my ability to respond. It was clear she wanted to delegitimize my reporting." Greaves nodded. "And what happened after the press conference?" Atwood exhaled dramatically. "It unleashed a wave of online harassment. My email was flooded with threats. My family was targeted. All because I was doing my job." Karoline's patience wore thin. She leaned over to Mercer and whispered, "Time to expose this nonsense." Her attorney smirked. "You read my mind." Mercer stood. "Your Honor, we have questions for the witness." Judge Winslow gestured for him to proceed. Mercer approached the stand. "Mr. Atwood, just to clarify, you believe Ms. Leavitt's words directly caused people to threaten you?" "Yes," Atwood said firmly. Mercer nodded. "And you, as a journalist, believe in holding public officials accountable?" "Of course." Mercer paced slightly. "So, when you accuse a press secretary of misleading the public, and she responds by correcting you, that's an attack on free speech?" Atwood hesitated. "It's about power dynamics. She has a government platform. I don't." A few chuckles broke out in the courtroom. Everyone knew that was a stretch. Atwood was a major media figure with millions of viewers. Mercer smiled. "Mr. Atwood, have you ever criticized a politician on your show?" "Yes." "And have those politicians ever faced public backlash because of your reporting?" Atwood's jaw tightened. "That's different." Mercer raised an eyebrow. "How?" Atwood fumbled for words. Because my job is to inform the public." Mercer let the silence hang for a moment before delivering the final blow. "And Ms. Leavitt's job is to respond to those claims. Unless, of course, you're saying journalists are above criticism." Atwood's lips parted, but no words came out. The energy in the courtroom shifted. Karoline suppressed a smile. The prosecution's star witness had just unraveled. A thick silence hung over the courtroom. Mark Atwood fidgeted in his seat, clearly realizing that he had walked into a trap. Across the room, Karoline watched with quiet satisfaction. She had spent years dealing with journalists like Atwood, people who claimed to hold power accountable but recoiled the moment someone held them to the same standard. Mercer pressed on. "Mr. Atwood, you just admitted that you frequently criticize public officials. You even acknowledged that some of your reports lead to public backlash. Are you suggesting that when you do it, it's journalism, but when my client does it, it's harassment?" Atwood licked his lips, looking toward the prosecutor's table. Greaves, for the first time since the trial began, seemed genuinely concerned. "Well," Mercer prompted. Atwood sighed. "Look, I'm not saying press secretaries can't respond, but when Ms. Leavitt called me out by name, it made me a target." Mercer tilted his head. "Interesting. Mr. Atwood, have you ever called a politician out by name in your reporting?" Atwood hesitated, then reluctantly nodded. "So, by your logic, If one of your viewers takes offense and acts inappropriately, should you be held responsible? That's not the same. Why not? Atwood opened his mouth but had no answer. The jury was watching him closely now, their expressions skeptical. The journalists in the gallery scribbled notes furiously. Mercer turned to the judge. Your Honor, the witness has just admitted to doing the exact thing he's accusing my client of. The prosecution's entire argument hinges on the idea that words can be legally punishable if they lead to public outrage. But by that standard, this very trial could be used against Mr. Atwood himself. Judge Winslow exhaled sharply and adjusted his glasses. He wasn't enjoying this anymore. Mr. Mercer, are you suggesting that public figures should be completely immune from scrutiny? Not at all, Your Honor, Mercer replied smoothly. I'm suggesting that we apply the same standard to both sides. If a journalist can challenge a government official without legal consequences, then a government official should be able to challenge a journalist without legal consequences. The judge tapped his fingers against his desk. He knew where this was going. If he ruled against Karoline, he would be setting a precedent that could one day be used against the media itself. Greaves stood up, clearly eager to regain control. Your Honor, I move to redirect. Mr. Atwood, can you describe how this ordeal has impacted your personal life? Atwood straightened, happy to change the subject. Of course, after Ms. Leavitt's remarks, my home address was leaked. My wife received threatening messages. My employer had to increase security. It was terrifying. A few sympathetic murmurs spread through the courtroom. Greaves nodded. And you believe Ms. Leavitt's comments directly contributed to this? Yes, Atwood said firmly. Mercer didn't flinch. Objection, Your Honor, speculation. Judge Winslow hesitated. Sustained. Mr. Atwood, unless you have direct evidence that my client incited these threats, we cannot hold her responsible for them. Greaves clenched his jaw. He had walked right into it. Without a direct link between Karoline's comments and the harassment Atwood received, his argument fell apart. Atwood shifted in his seat, looking down. The once confident journalist was now a man who had overplayed his hand. Karoline watched with measured patience. The prosecution was losing its grip, and she knew it. Judge Winslow sighed, rubbing his temples. Mr. Greaves, unless you have additional evidence, I suggest we move on. The prosecutor's lips pressed into a thin line. He had no choice. No further questions, Your Honor. Atwood stepped down from the witness stand, his shoulders noticeably lower than when he had walked in. As he passed Karoline's table, she simply gave him a small, knowing smile. The tide had turned. As Mark Atwood slumped back into his seat, the prosecution's momentum had all but vanished. Karoline sat still, her face composed, but inside, she knew they had just won a major battle. However, the war wasn't over yet. Judge Winslow leaned forward. Mr. Greaves, do you have another witness? Or are we moving to closing arguments? Greaves hesitated. He had planned to spend more time dismantling Karoline's credibility, but Atwood's testimony had backfired. He needed anything to regain control of the case. Then, as if grasping at a last lifeline, he turned and whispered something to his assistant. Karoline narrowed her eyes. She recognized that kind of desperate move. After a moment, Greaves straightened his tie and spoke. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to call one final witness. We ask the court's patience, as this witness was only recently made available. Judge Winslow's eyebrow lifted. Mr. Greaves, we agreed on witnesses in advance. This individual came forward just this morning, Greaves insisted. We believe their testimony is crucial. The judge glanced at Mercer. Objection. Mercer exchanged a look with Karoline. Something was off, but objecting now could make them look like they had something to hide. He gave a slight shake of his head. No objection, Your Honor, Mercer said, though there was clear caution in his voice. Very well, Judge Winslow muttered. Proceed. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A tall, slender woman in her mid-40s stepped in. She had sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of quiet authority. Karoline frowned. The woman looked vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place her. Greaves smiled. The prosecution calls Dr. Evelyn Carter to the stand. A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. Mercer stiffened beside Karoline. Now that, he murmured, is an interesting play. Karoline leaned closer. Who is she? Mercer kept his eyes on the witness as she took the oath. A behavioral psychologist. She's made a career out of testifying in high-profile cases about media influence and radicalization. Karoline's stomach clenched slightly. She already knew where this was going. Greaves stepped forward. Dr. Carter, can you explain to the court what your expertise is? Dr. Carter adjusted the microphone. I specialize in mass communication and its psychological effects on public perception. My research focuses on how rhetoric can lead to behavioral shifts, including acts of aggression or harassment. Karoline exhaled slowly. So that was the strategy. The prosecution couldn't prove she had directly incited harassment, so they had brought in an academic to argue that her influence was enough. Greaves nodded approvingly. Dr. Carter, based on your expertise, can you explain how the words of a powerful figure, such as Ms. Leavitt, can incite hostile actions without explicitly calling for them? Dr. Carter folded her hands. Absolutely. Public figures carry authority, whether they intend to or not. When they make strong, critical statements about individuals, their followers often interpret those words as calls to action, even if no direct instruction is given. This is known as implied incitement. Karoline's jaw tightened. She had heard variations of this argument before. It was a dangerous game, one that blurred the line between free speech and thought policing. Greaves turned to the jury. So even if Ms. Leavitt never told her supporters to harass Mr. Atwood, her words created the conditions where such harassment became inevitable? Yes, Dr. Carter affirmed. Influence matters more than intent. Mercer leaned back slightly, deep in thought. Karoline could see the gears turning in his head. He was planning his counterstrike. Greaves pressed on. Dr. Carter, in your expert opinion, does Ms. Leavitt's rhetoric fit the pattern of speech that has historically led to public threats against journalists? Dr. Carter gave a firm nod. Yes, it does. A satisfied smile tugged at the corners of Greaves's mouth. He turned to Mercer. Your witness. Mercer stood slowly, adjusting his suit. He took a few steps toward the stand before stopping, as if pondering something. Dr. Carter, he began, his tone casual. You've testified in several high-profile cases, correct? Yes. And have you ever testified against media personalities? Say, journalists who have used strong rhetoric against politicians. Dr. Carter hesitated for a fraction of a second. No, I have not been asked to. Mercer's eyebrows lifted. Interesting. So when reporters call politicians liars, corrupt, or threats to democracy, do their words also carry the risk of implied incitement? Dr. Carter pursed her lips. The context is different. Mercer nodded as if he expected that answer. And who determines that context, Doctor? You? The media? Or should we apply one standard to everyone? A murmur passed through the courtroom. Karoline watched as Dr. Carter hesitated again. She had no good answer to that. Mercer let the silence linger before delivering his final blow. One last question, Dr. Carter. If someone interprets a journalist's words as encouragement to attack a politician, should the journalist be held responsible? Dr. Carter exhaled sharply. That's not the same thing. Mercer shrugged. I suppose that depends on who is on trial. With that, he turned away. No further questions. Dr. Carter stepped down, visibly uncomfortable. Karoline let herself smile. The prosecution had tried to twist free speech into a crime, and they had failed. Judge Winslow cleared his throat. We will reconvene tomorrow for closing arguments. As the courtroom emptied, Karoline felt a surge of energy. They weren't just winning. They were exposing the game. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, legal analysts, and political commentators had filled every available seat, eager to witness the final showdown. The case had become more than just a legal battle. It was a defining moment for free speech in America. Karoline adjusted her blazer, her hands steady. She had always known that words carried power, but today, she would see if truth could still triumph over political gamesmanship. Judge Winslow called the court to order. We will now proceed with closing arguments. Mr. Greaves, you may begin. The lead prosecutor stood, buttoning his jacket with an air of confidence. He strode toward the jury, making direct eye contact. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice measured and solemn. This case is about accountability. It is not about politics, nor is it an attack on free speech. It is about recognizing the consequences of reckless rhetoric. He gestured toward Mark Atwood, who sat rigidly in the gallery. We have shown that Ms. Leavitt, with full knowledge of her influence, targeted a private citizen. She used the full weight of her government platform to single out a journalist, and in the days that followed, he and his family suffered real harm. That is not political discourse. That is abuse of power. Greaves turned back to the jury. I want you to imagine that this had happened to you, that an official in the highest office in the land pointed a finger at your name. Would you feel safe? A few jurors shifted uncomfortably. Karoline noticed one of them, a middle-aged woman, biting her lip as she listened. Greaves softened his tone. The defense wants you to believe that words don't matter. But words do matter. They shape opinions, inspire action, and, when wielded irresponsibly, they can destroy lives. We ask that you send a message that no one, not even the most powerful voices in the country, is above the law. He straightened his tie and gave a slight nod. The prosecution rests. The room was silent as Greaves returned to his seat. Then, slowly, Mercer stood. He didn't immediately walk toward the jury. Instead, he stood at his table, gazing at them thoughtfully. Words do matter, he finally said, echoing Greaves's sentiment. They matter so much that our entire nation was founded on the principle that we are free to use them. Now, he took a slow step forward. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution would have you believe that Karoline Leavitt is on trial for reckless rhetoric. But let's be honest. This case isn't about reckless rhetoric. It's about who gets to speak freely and who doesn't. He let the words hang in the air before continuing. They argue that my client's words led to harassment. But under that logic, should journalists be held accountable when their reports lead to threats against politicians? Should celebrities be charged when their comments spark online outrage? Where does it end? Mercer shook his head. The truth is, the prosecution wants to punish my client not because she broke the law, but because she challenged someone they believe should be untouchable. Karoline's pulse quickened. Mercer was walking a tightrope, but he was doing it masterfully. He turned toward the jury. Mark Atwood is not a helpless victim. He is a journalist, a man whose entire job is to scrutinize public figures. He built his career on calling out politicians. And yet, the moment someone fights back with words, he runs to the courts? That is not justice. That is hypocrisy. Mercer then pointed toward Dr. Carter's empty witness stand. We heard from a so-called expert that public figures should be held responsible for how people interpret their words. But let's be honest. If that standard were applied equally, half the journalists, activists, and commentators in this country would be on trial right now. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. There is no crime here, he said firmly. There is only an attempt to silence someone for daring to speak. And in this country, we do not silence people. We protect them. He placed his hands on the defense table. I ask you, do not set a precedent that weakens the First Amendment. Do not create a system where one group of people can speak freely while another is punished for responding. Do what is right. Find Karoline Leavitt not guilty. With that, he sat down. The courtroom was tense. Even Judge Winslow seemed unsettled as he addressed the jury. You have heard the arguments. You will now deliberate and return with a verdict. As the jury filed out, Karoline closed her eyes briefly. It was out of their hands now. She just had to hope that justice and common sense would prevail. The jury had been deliberating for nearly 5 hours. Inside the courthouse, reporters huddled together, exchanging theories and updates. Cable news anchors filled the airwaves with speculation. Across the country, social media was ablaze with debates over free speech, political bias, and the role of public figures in shaping discourse. Karoline Leavitt sat still at the defense table, her hands clasped together. She had faced scrutiny before, but this was different. This wasn't just about her. It was about the precedent the case would set for every political figure, journalist, and citizen in America. Beside her, Mercer tapped his pen rhythmically against the table. 5 hours, he murmured. That means they're divided. Karoline gave him a sidelong glance. Do you think that's good or bad? Mercer smirked. That depends on how much faith you have in common sense. Before Karoline could respond, the doors to the courtroom swung open. A bailiff stepped inside and announced in a steady voice, "The jury has reached a verdict." A hush fell over the room as people scrambled back to their seats. Karoline felt her pulse quicken. This was it. The jury re-entered the courtroom, their faces unreadable. The foreman, a man in his 50s with sharp features and salt and pepper hair, held a slip of paper in his hands. He passed it to the bailiff, who then handed it to Judge Winslow. The judge adjusted his glasses and read the verdict silently before nodding. His expression remained neutral as he addressed the jury. "Members of the jury, have you reached a unanimous decision?" "We have, Your Honor." Judge Winslow gave a single nod. "Please read the verdict." The foreman cleared his throat. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. In the matter of the state of New York versus Karoline Leavitt, on the charge of reckless endangerment through public speech, we find the defendant. A beat of silence. "Not guilty." A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom, immediately followed by murmurs and a few audible outbursts. Karoline exhaled a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She turned to Mercer, who gave her a satisfied nod. Judge Winslow banged his gavel. "Order in the court." The murmurs died down as the judge continued. "The jury has found the defendant not guilty. Ms. Leavitt, you are free to go." For the first time since the trial had begun, Karoline allowed herself to smile. She had won. Not just for herself, but for free speech. Across the room, Mark Atwood stood abruptly and stormed toward the exit, his face flushed with anger. Greaves, his head lowered, gathered his files without a word. The press wasted no time. As soon as Karoline stepped out of the courtroom, she was swarmed by reporters. Microphones and cameras were thrust toward her. "Ms. Leavitt, what do you have to say about the verdict? Do you feel vindicated? What message do you think this sends about political speech?" Karoline raised her hand, and the crowd quieted slightly. Then, in a steady, confident voice, she said, "Today's verdict is not just a victory for me. It is a victory for every American who believes in the right to speak freely. This trial was never about justice. It was about setting a dangerous precedent that would allow powerful institutions to silence dissent. The jury saw through it, and today the First Amendment stands strong." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the reporters clamoring behind her. As she stepped outside into the bright afternoon sun, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. She had fought, she had won, and the battle for truth was far from over. Karoline Leavitt stepped into the crisp autumn air outside the courthouse, feeling the weight of the past weeks slowly lift from her shoulders. She had fought for her right to speak freely and won. But as she looked at the frenzied media outside, she knew the battle was far from over. Reporters shouted questions, desperate for more sound bites. Some framed her as a free speech hero, while others painted her as reckless and irresponsible. Social media was in flames, with trending hashtags ranging from #JusticeForCaroline to #AccountabilityLost. Mercer nudged her. "You're about to be the most polarizing woman in America." She smirked. "That's nothing new." They pushed through the crowd and into a waiting car. As soon as the doors shut, Mercer let out a breath of relief. "You realize how big this is, right? You didn't just win a case, you set a legal precedent. This will be studied for decades." Karoline nodded but stayed quiet. She wasn't just thinking about the legal impact. She was thinking about the political storm she was about to walk into, the political fallout. That evening, every major news network covered the verdict. On conservative outlets, Karoline was hailed as a champion of free speech. Pundits praised her for standing firm against what they called the weaponization of the legal system against conservatives. Her supporters flooded social media with messages of support, and even President Trump himself posted on Truth Social. Karoline Leavitt just defended the First Amendment in court and won. A huge victory for free speech. The radical left tried to silence her and failed. Proud of my press secretary. On the other hand, liberal networks expressed outrage. Commentators called the verdict a dangerous precedent, arguing that public officials should face consequences for inciting harassment. Some even suggested Congress should introduce new laws to hold government figures accountable for their public statements. Mark Atwood released a bitter statement. This verdict is a disgrace. Today, the justice system failed every journalist in America. The fight is not over. His legal team hinted at possible civil litigation, but Mercer wasn't worried. That's just him trying to save face, he told Karoline. If he couldn't prove intent in a criminal trial, he won't stand a chance in civil court. Still, Karoline knew this wasn't just about the law. This was about public perception. The White House response. The next morning, Karoline walked into the White House briefing room as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The press corps was buzzing. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting to see if she had been humbled or emboldened. She stepped to the podium, adjusting her papers. Good afternoon. A reporter from CNN fired the first shot. Karoline, given the jury's verdict, do you feel any remorse for what happened to Mark Atwood? She looked him directly in the eyes. I feel remorse that we live in a time where journalists believe they can attack public figures without expecting a response. A murmur rippled through the room. Some reporters scowled. Others smirked. Another hand shot up. The verdict may have cleared you legally, but do you think it was ethical for a government official to call out a private citizen like that? Karoline leaned forward. Let's be clear. Mark Atwood is not a private citizen. He is a journalist with a national platform. He makes a living scrutinizing people in power. But when someone finally scrutinizes him, suddenly it's a crime. She shook her head. That's not how America works. The room was silent for a beat. Then a dozen more questions exploded at once. She had won in court. Now she was winning the war of narratives. Epilogue, the road ahead. In the weeks that followed, Karoline's political stock soared. Some saw her as a rising star in the Republican Party, a fearless fighter for conservative values. Others viewed her as a symbol of everything wrong with modern politics. There were calls for new legislation, legal think pieces dissecting the case, and heated debates across college campuses. The words Leavitt versus State of New York were already being cited in discussions about free speech law. As for Karoline herself, she wasn't done. She had faced the system and beaten it, and now she was ready for whatever came next.